Hello, and welcome to Early and Often, the history of elections in America, Episode 27, Black Kings. Before we get started, one quick note. Jerry Landry over at the Presidencies of the United States podcast asked me to record the introductory quote for his latest episode, so if you want to hear a few more seconds of my voice, or if you just want to check out another podcast about American political history, go check it out. I was literally just listening to it myself, and it's very well researched and full of detail. That's the Presidencies of the United States podcast. If you Google it, it's the first thing that comes up. Let's begin. Last time, we talked about the history of New England through the early 1700s. Today, I'm going to give a more general overview of how the political system was developing around this time, as well as look at how the slaves of New England organized themselves politically. By the start of the 1700s, the signs were everywhere that New England was moving on from its heritage of strict Puritanism. This was the age of enlightenment in Europe, when the ideal of understanding the world through science and reason reached a new high watermark, and many of those ideas were starting to filter into New England. Ideas about natural rights, like those of John Locke, were starting to come into vogue as well, although older ideas of rights as a traditional inheritance still had currency too. A 1728 letter from the Connecticut House of Representatives expressed this nicely. Quote, "It's the privilege of Englishmen, and the natural right of all men who have not forfeited it, to be governed by laws made by their own consent." End quote. Both traditional rights and natural rights are presented side by side, with neither being privileged over the other. In the middle of the 18th century, Harvard revamped its curriculum, bringing in modern science and the like, though it was still a thoroughly religious institution. Not that many people went to Harvard. The largest class around that time only had 63 people in it, but much of the region's leadership went there, so a change in curriculum mattered. In 1704, the first newspaper in America was founded in Boston, the Newsletter as it was called. Others followed in the decades to come in Boston and elsewhere. Also, taverns were becoming an increasingly important location for political discussion, sort of the American equivalent of the coffee house in Europe. A few tavern owners even managed to hold elective office, although that was unusual. But the important thing is that New England society was now about much more than religion. It was now doing all the things that normal societies do. Which isn't to say that New England couldn't still be stifling, though. Benjamin Franklin was born in Boston in 1706, but he ran away to Philadelphia at age 17 in search of better prospects. More about him later. The most visible change was, of course, Massachusetts' new government. As I talked about last time, the governor was now appointed by the king, and the upper house was no longer directly elected. Just as importantly, the Puritan character of the government had largely been eliminated. You no longer had to be a Puritan to vote, you just had to own property. Well, as long as you were Protestant, anyway. Sometimes Catholics and or Jews were denied the right to vote or even to become citizens. Not that there were many Catholics or Jews in New England yet. In Massachusetts and Connecticut, the property requirement to vote for delegates to the General Court was the 40-shilling freehold, which had long been the standard for voting in England. That meant you had to own land or other property worth at least 40 shillings a year. In practice, any 5-acre farm would probably meet this requirement. And voting in town elections was usually even easier. There were slight variations in New Hampshire and Rhode Island, but that was the basic setup. This new arrangement was very similar to how things were done in the other colonies. In practice, more than half of adult men had the vote, maybe even 3/4, depending on which historian is doing the estimate. This was possibly less than in the previous century, but it was still higher than elsewhere in America, and way, way, way higher than in England. And many of those men who couldn't vote were basically just young adults who were still living with their parents, who hadn't moved out onto their own farm yet. In time, many of them would end up eligible to vote, so few men were excluded from voting for their whole lives. The voting age remained fixed at 21, though both Massachusetts and New Hampshire briefly raised it to 24 at one point. There are a few rare cases of men or boys younger than that being allowed to vote. One 18-year-old was allowed to vote because he had inherited his late father's estate. But that was irregular and not strictly legal. Men under the age of 21 were allowed to vote in elections for militia leaders if they were in a militia, but that was it. Apparently there are few records in some Massachusetts towns of propertied widows being allowed to vote on occasion, presumably as representatives of their late husbands' estates, but that was also very much the exception. Town leaders bending the rules for an important local notable. Other than the new property requirements, election procedures were reasonably similar to how they had been in the previous century. Elections were held annually except in New Hampshire, where they were held every 3 years. The town was still the basic unit of government, etc. The voting laws were usually vague. They didn't specify how elections were to be run. They just set out some basic guidelines and tradition filled in the rest on a town-by-town basis. Occasionally, there were attempts by officials to bypass these rules through trickery. For instance, in the town of Brunswick, the selectmen were required to announce upcoming elections by putting a notice on the door of the town's meeting house where everyone would see it. The selectmen put up a notice, but they put it on the inside of the door instead of on the outside, so that it would be seen by fewer people. However, these kinds of shenanigans were the exception. The most common way to influence an election was to challenge the qualifications of the voters who opposed you, asking whether they had enough property to vote or whether they were legally residents of the town. The New Englanders preferred legal ways of tampering with elections to underhanded ones. There is another case of a selectman just throwing some ballots away, but again, that was the exception. So it was still pretty easy to vote, but as it turns out, not that many men took advantage of their right to do so. As a rule, elections in New England had never been that hotly contested. Usually there wasn't much of a fight at all, and even when there was, campaigns lasted only a few weeks at most, sometimes only a few hours. Nor was it that common for officials to fail to get re-elected. Politics just wasn't usually worth fighting over, and that was only slowly starting to change. Plus, the Puritan culture of deference to one's superiors remained strong. By the middle of the century, various disputes over religion, money, and war would lead to more contested elections, but not yet. Before the creation of the Dominion, relations with England had been one of the dominant issues in New England politics, and although the colonies had reached a new, stable arrangement with England, relations with the mother country were still important. The legislature spent a lot of time trying to assert itself over the governors and other royal appointees. Certainly the members of the General Court liked to position themselves as defenders of the rights of the people against royal authority. However, it isn't exactly clear how much the colonists themselves cared about any of this. Despite the fights with the governor, turnout was never all that high. We don't have complete records from this period, but Robert J. Dinkin estimates that turnout in New England was typically between 10 and 25% of eligible voters. Coastal cities like Boston had fewer eligible voters than smaller inland towns because of their greater inequality, but turnout was probably higher there since more elections were contested and since it was just easier to get to a meeting house to vote. So probably the total number of voters was similar in both city and country. There is evidence that people who lived closer to their local meeting house were more likely to vote than those living further out, which is unsurprising. What is surprising is that there's no evidence that rich citizens were more likely to vote than poorer citizens. In fact, the opposite is true. It looks like the rich were less likely to vote than everyone else, not just in New England but across America. Perhaps the rich saw elections as populist and lowbrow. Perhaps because government was so small and taxes were so low, the rich simply didn't feel the need to bother with voting. Definitely a striking difference between then and now. Today, your income is a very strong predictor of how likely you are to vote. But when they did vote, the rich and poor voted similarly, as far as historians can tell. Both groups supported the same candidates in roughly the same proportions. Politics was not divided by class. Another interesting finding is that fathers and sons tended to vote the same way. In a study of 4 towns in Rhode Island, father and son voted for the same candidate 71% of the time. Often, who you voted for was more of a family decision. If you were friends with someone who was running for office, you'd bring your kids along to support them. Turnout was higher when there was a close election or when there was a big dispute over some local policy. For instance, one of the highest turnouts in Boston was over whether or not to build a marketplace, but even that usually wasn't enough to get turnout above 50%. When a two-party system emerged in Rhode Island in the 1750s, turnout consistently remained above 40%, but that was about as high as it got. Now, I said that turnout was probably similar in the big cities and in the smaller towns, but there's an important caveat to that. It was often the case that the smaller towns further inland simply didn't hold elections at all, at least not to send delegates to the General Court. It was often deemed too expensive for a town of maybe a few dozen families to support someone going to and from Boston for months at a time. Plus, communication was so slow that rural parts of New England were often simply unaware of what was going on in the capital, which made it hard for them to make an informed choice in the first place. So instead of voting to pick a delegate, they voted to not pick anyone at all. They did send a lot of petitions to the legislature over various issues, but not so many delegates. For instance, in 1763, out of 168 towns in Massachusetts, 64 towns sent no representatives at all. 104 towns sent only one, even though most of them were entitled to send 2, and just 4 towns sent 2 delegates. And even when representatives were elected, they often just didn't show up. As a result, the lower house of the legislature often had fewer than 100 delegates in it, out of a potential 350. And of those 100 delegates, a dozen or so leaders had primary control of most of the legislative agenda. These leaders mostly came from Boston or the other coastal towns, which accounted for less than a quarter of the delegates but over half of the General Court's leadership. The inland towns, conversely, were significantly underrepresented at the higher echelons of power. So despite the fact that these small towns were hypothetically very overrepresented, in practice politics was dominated by a coastal elite. The small towns still had a big say, but much less than you might expect. Clearly, people back then were not so concerned with exercising their full political might. They usually didn't vote, and even when they did vote, oftentimes they voted simply to keep the office vacant. And just as importantly, nobody organized to defend their group interests. Maybe politics was just less important to people's lives. Maybe the colonists just didn't realize how much power they wielded as voters. Maybe potential candidates didn't quite realize what it took to win in a democracy. It actually reminds me a bit of the filibuster in modern American politics. The filibuster, if you're not familiar with it, is a procedure in the Senate which allows a minority within the Senate to block bills from being voted on, against the wishes of the majority, which can effectively kill the bill. Now, the filibuster was created by accident way back in the early 1800s, an unintentional byproduct of changes to the Senate's rules. But it took decades for anyone to actually use the filibuster, and for a very long time the filibuster was used pretty sparingly, even though in principle it allowed the minority party to get its way. But then, over time, use of the filibuster has slowly escalated as both parties have realized its power. By now, use of the filibuster is routine, and the minority party regularly blocks bills which have majority support. Now, eventually this may lead to the filibuster being eliminated altogether, but that's not my point. My point is that it can take a surprisingly long time for people to grab onto power effectively. Even if you have a tool like the filibuster at your disposal, you might not use it, or you might use it sparingly. For one thing, you might not even be aware that it exists, like in the first decades after the filibuster was accidentally created. Then you might not know how to use it properly. Then you might use it rarely as part of an informal agreement with your opponents to avoid mutual destruction or at least mutual annoyance. It took the filibuster 2 centuries for these norms to break down. I think something similar may have been the case in colonial New England. The New Englanders had the vote, but they didn't know how to use it, nor was there any real understanding of how powerful it could be. They knew elections mattered, of course, but their understanding was far from modern. And without political parties, there was no one with a strong enough incentive to figure it out. So for a long time, the political system just limped along, randomly lumbering forward without any clear direction. A gentleman's game, not a struggle where every vote counts. But as we'll see in the next few episodes, it couldn't last. Once people grasped firmly for power, then everyone else had to do so as well. Now, everything I've been talking about, everything to do with the governments of New England, mostly has to do with the white settlers who were living there. There were never any laws against free blacks or Native Americans voting or participating in government, but the cultural distance between the groups was such that it rarely happened. I do know of one town in Massachusetts where Indians voted: Stockbridge. Stockbridge had been set up by missionaries for some of the local Mohicans, sort of as a reservation. Apparently it was run along the lines of a normal New England town, with town meetings and everything. However, over time, Stockbridge was overrun by white settlers through legal trickery, and the experiment was brought to an end within a few decades. There are no records of free blacks voting, but it may have happened in a few isolated instances. Remember, there are records of blacks voting in Virginia and South Carolina occasionally during this period. Still, if there was participation by free blacks, it must have been very limited. However, even if Africans in New England were cut off from the white government which ruled them, they partly made up for it by creating their own informal governments, with their own informal elections to match. These elections will be the subject of the rest of this episode. To start, I need to talk a bit more about slavery in New England. The number of slaves remained relatively small, only a few % of the population. Perhaps 1,200 slaves were imported per decade in the first half of the 1700s, but the numbers declined after that. Birth rates were low and mortality was high, at least relative to white New Englanders. As a result, most of the slaves in the region had been born in Africa rather than in America, up until about 1750. Having survived the almost unimaginable horrors of the Middle Passage and arrived in cold New England 5,000 miles away from home, the slaves found themselves in a new cultural world. America was wealthy and full of technological marvels, but most of that was unavailable to the slaves. For one thing, they were slaves, but even if they were freed, Puritan society remained racist. To be African meant that you were necessarily an outsider to the social order. Much of New England life would always be closed off to you. Still, as a small minority at the mercy of a powerful majority, a high degree of assimilation was inevitable over time. You simply had to accustom yourself to Western ways of living in order to get along. And because there were no plantations so far north, many slaves worked as servants in individual households, which meant that they spent every day immersed in Western culture. According to some white New Englanders, this was in part a civilizing mission that would in time benefit the Africans themselves. In the words of Cotton Mather, quote, "They are barbarous, but so were our own ancestors. Christianity will be the best cure for this barbarity. It may seem unto us as little purpose to teach as to wash an Ethiopian, but the greater must be our application." End quote. But even that was idealistic relative to how slavery worked in reality. Some slaves were taught basic literacy and math, but beyond that there was little in the way of education. There were a few success stories: Newport Gardner, who composed music and even opened up a singing school while still a slave, or Phillis Wheatley, who wrote noteworthy poetry just 9 years after arriving in America, but those were unusual cases. A fair number of slaves were freed over time. Perhaps some 40% of blacks in Massachusetts were free by 1764. However, even though they were legally free, they were by no means free in the full sense of the word. In some ways, it was easier to be a slave than to be free, because a successful slave was seen as less of a threat to public order. If they did too well for themselves economically, free blacks faced the wrath of their white neighbors, who might use the courts to attack them. Towns often tried to prevent black freedmen from moving in, and in 1718, Connecticut passed a law banning blacks from buying land, although it wasn't always enforced. Even churches were segregated. One church actually constructed a box around the black pews so that the whites wouldn't have to see them. Unsurprisingly, there were few converts at first. That would only come later, when blacks developed a native form of Christianity which emphasized liberation rather than servitude. As a result of this sort of discrimination, even freed blacks in New England were almost certain to remain in poverty, clustered in shanty towns in the main port cities of the region. That was where the African population, both slave and free, was greatest, in the bigger cities. For example, in Boston in 1742, there were about 1,500 blacks all told. Not many, but enough to sustain a subculture of their own. Sadly, we can't get into all the complexities of life for blacks in colonial New England. If you're interested in learning more, I'd recommend the book Black Yankees, The Development of an Afro-American Subculture in 18th Century New England by William Dillon Pearson. That's where I'm getting most of my information. But there is one topic that is directly relevant to this podcast: slave elections. Among the whites of New England, Election Day was an annual holiday marked by celebrations and feasting, and so it was among their slaves. When white slave owners traveled to the city for elections, they often took their slaves with them. The slaves, not having much to do, would meet with each other and hold festivities of their own. At some point, they also began holding elections of their own, choosing leaders who would represent their community over the next year. Free blacks may have voted as well, though I'm not absolutely sure about that. Slave elections were actually a pretty common practice among slave societies in the Americas, including in New Orleans and across South America and the Caribbean, though not in the Chesapeake or the Carolinas as far as I've seen. In these societies, slaves would elect a king and queen for the year, would dress them up in the finest clothes they had, and hold a celebratory parade or something like that. This was probably an adaptation of traditional West African practices. In Africa at the time, it was common for kings to be elected rather than inheriting the title. In New England, African traditions melded with Puritan ones. For instance, in Connecticut and Rhode Island, instead of electing kings, the slaves elected governors, while in Massachusetts and New Hampshire they were still called kings. Also, the practice of electing queens was dropped. Only men could hold office in New England, free or slave. You might think that white New Englanders would find this threatening, slaves getting together to organize themselves so explicitly, but apparently they found it more humorous than anything else. Plus, they were happy to have a leader they could deal with who could enforce their rules among his fellow slaves. These elections began sometime in the early to mid-1700s and gradually spread throughout New England, to most of the towns where there was a substantial slave population. At least 24 towns were known to have had these elections by the early 1800s. The exact election procedures varied from place to place. Black elections weren't always held on the same day as white elections, but it was usually around the same time. The celebrations could last a whole week, during which time little work was done by the slaves. The elections were typically held on some open ground under the shade of a large tree. In some towns there were actual ballots, in others you voted by voice, and in still others you stood in a line to indicate who you supported. Only men could vote, but women were still involved in the politicking behind the scenes. Sometimes there was even a property requirement to vote, as in Newport, Rhode Island, where at one point you had to own a pig and a sty in order to be able to vote. But usually things were more informal than that. Let me quote at length a description of the elections from the 1840s by the writer Wilkins Updike. The practice had mostly died out by the time he wrote this, so it's not a contemporaneous account. It's perhaps a little fanciful and it's very long, but it's too interesting not to quote in full. Note how much cooperation these elections required from the white population. Masters provided money, food, horses, and even weapons to their slaves. Quote, in imitation of the whites, the Negroes held an annual election on the third Saturday in June, when they elected their governor. When the slaves were numerous, each town held its election. This annual festivity was looked for with anxiety. Party was as violent and acrimonious with them as among the whites. The slaves assumed the power and pride, and took the relative rank of their masters, and it was degrading to the reputation of the owner if his slave appeared in inferior apparel or with less money than the slave of another master of equal wealth. The horses of the wealthy landholders were, on this day, all surrendered to the use of the slaves, and, with cues, real or false, head pomadumed and powdered, cocked hat, mounted on the best Narragansett pacers, sometimes with their master's swords, with their ladies on pillions, they pranced to election, which commenced generally at 10 o'clock. The canvass for votes soon began. The tables, with refreshments, were spread, and all friends of the respective candidates were solicited to partake, and as much anxiety and interest would manifest itself, and as much family pride and influence were exercised and interest created, as in other elections, and preceded by weeks of parliamentering. About 1 o'clock the vote would be taken, by arranging the friends of the respective candidates in 2 lines, under the direction of a chief marshal with assistants. There was generally a tumultuous crisis until the court commenced, when silence was proclaimed, and after that no man could change sides or go from one rank to the other. The chief marshal announced the number of votes for each candidate and, in an audible voice, proclaimed the name of the governor elected for the ensuing year. The election treat corresponded in extravagance to the wealth of his master. The defeated candidate was, according to custom, introduced by the chief marshal and drank the first toast after the inauguration, and all animosities were forgotten. At dinner the governor was seated at the head of the long table, under trees or in an arbor, with the unsuccessful candidate at his right and his lady on the left. The afternoon was spent in dancing, games of quoits, that is, a game similar to horseshoes, and athletic exercises. As these slaves decreased in number, these elections became more concentrated. In 1795, elections were held in both North Kingstown and South Kingstown, but in a few years one was held in the latter only, and they have for years ceased. The servant of the late Honorable E.R. Potter was elected governor about 1800. The canvass was very expensive to his master. Soon after the election, Mr. Potter had a conference with the governor, and stated to him that one or the other must give up politics, or the expense would ruin them both. Governor John took the wisest course, abandoned politics, and retired to the shades of private life. End quote. As you heard, these elections were lively affairs, much more raucous than Puritan elections. Over time, some of that raucousness was carried over to elections among the whites, which became less buttoned down by the end of the century. Apparently most white New Englanders were okay with their slaves being armed with swords and even with guns for a day, or at least they learned to live with it. I mean, the slave owners willingly loaned their weapons out, so it can't have been that big a deal to them. It was all seen as humorous and in good fun. Maybe the slaves were just too few in number to be a real threat. So what sort of men were elected as governors? They were mostly men born in Africa rather than New England, and apparently, of the winners we can identify, at least a third likely came from African royal families. It was also important that your master be wealthy enough to finance your campaign, and many of the black governors' masters were themselves politically noteworthy men. Physical strength and intelligence were important as well, as was the ability to make quick decisions. So, rich, well-born, and well-spoken. Basically the same sorts of traits looked for in leaders everywhere. What did the kings do? What was the point of being king? Well, for one thing, it meant that you were a respected local leader, at least among your fellow slaves, and they might turn to you for advice or for help resolving a dispute. You were also in charge of organizing local festivities like the elections. The governors were also in charge of a small informal government, and they might appoint other officials to work for them, such as sheriffs or justices of the peace. I assume that they were in charge of basically the same sorts of things that any local government is concerned with, albeit with some clear limits to their authority. Perhaps the most important part of this informal government was the system of local courts which were set up to resolve disputes among slaves. That way, slaves didn't need to turn to the masters every time there was an argument. They could come up with a solution themselves. The governor was at the head of the system. If you didn't like the local court's ruling, you could appeal to the governor and he would decide the matter. He also heard complaints from masters about misbehavior among their slaves. So, for instance, if a master had a problem with a slave, if he'd stolen something perhaps, he might bring that slave to the governor, who would hear the case and render his judgment. The governor could even sentence other slaves to be whipped on their backs or on the soles of their feet, which would be carried out by one of the sheriffs serving under him. Obviously not all crimes were dealt with this way, just the relatively less serious ones. You can see why the slave owners liked this system. It meant that punishments were handed down and performed by fellow slaves rather than by the masters themselves. It wasn't some culturally alien tyrant flaying you, but one of your equals. So perhaps it's not surprising that the New Englanders were so willing to allow their slaves the privilege of holding elections. Those elections were to some extent an informal way of extending white power over their slaves, by involving them and implicating them in that overall system of control. That wasn't the only thing going on, but surely it was part of it. On the plus side, it probably did give slaves some measure of control over their own lives, and perhaps some measure of pride in their local community. But whatever the advantages or disadvantages, this whole system of elections, kings, governors, and courts had probably begun to decline by around 1800. For one thing, as more and more towns started holding elections, the importance of each individual election declined. If there was only one election held in all of Rhode Island, then whoever won the election could plausibly claim to represent all the slaves in the province. However, if there were elections being held in each town, then the king or governor chosen could only be said to represent the slaves in that town and its surrounding areas. So the prestige associated with winning an election declined. And after the American Revolution, the New England states gradually abolished slavery over several decades, and so the population of slaves in New England dwindled to almost nothing by the 1840s. There were fewer and fewer slaves, while the freedmen no longer had wealthy patrons to sponsor their election campaigns. Also after the Revolution, the independent court system of the slaves was replaced by just the normal court system. For a while, the governors still had the power to informally resolve disputes among fellow African Americans, but they certainly had less authority than before. Nevertheless, despite their lesser prominence, the elections continued for some decades after independence. What finally did them in was white antipathy and violence. Now that the elections and election day parades were being done by free blacks instead of slaves, apparently they were seen as much more threatening to public order. If you were a slave, any pretensions you had to power could be laughed off as meaningless bluster and overinflated pride. Not so if you were black and free. That was dangerous. So, according to Pearson, quote, "The festivals were eventually ended after lower-class whites screaming racial epithets began to assault black parades, sometimes even trying to drag the governors down off their horses." End quote. So ended the black kings and black governors of New England. These elections were always fragile institutions, and they simply couldn't survive the violent disapproval of the white community. And that was that. Next episode, we'll continue the story of New England over the next few decades, and see just how much those wars with Quebec really cost, and how much strain they put on the political system. So join me next time on Early and Often, the history of elections in America. If you like the podcast, please rate it on iTunes. You can also keep track of Early and Often on Twitter at EarlyOftenPod, or read transcripts of every episode of the blog at earlyandoftenpodcast.wordpress.com. Thanks for listening.